and welcome to the NewsX Sunday Guardian Roundtable. Today we are in conversation with Professor Srinath Reddy, President of the Public Health Foundation of India, and someone who's been very vocal, who's been writing a lot on COVID, on long COVID, on the gap between vaccinations, and a whole lot of other issues also. In fact, Doctor, I would say you're someone who makes COVID simple, if it can be made simple in terms of understanding what one should do, what one shouldn't do. So I really enjoy these conversations of ours. I'm going to begin by asking you something that a lot of people are asking, the fear of a third wave.
Well, the fact that we are going to have waves because of the virus actually managing to get a free passage into the human society, I think that seems to be a general experience across different countries. But whether that will be actually a ripple or a tidal wave is entirely dependent on our response as well. And therefore, in terms of what India is likely to experience, yes, I believe we are likely to see some rise in cases. When and by how much, it is difficult to prophesy. I've seen various predictions on various models ranging from about 6 to 8 weeks from Dr. Bularia recently to about August, according to some models of the State Bank of India, November, according to some mathematical modelers. But all of these are predicated on what the virus is likely to do. But it doesn't take into account what we are likely to do. If we can be extremely disciplined in our own personal protection measures, as well as preventing super spreader events and gatherings, then we will be able to actually not only delay it, but to make sure that we are unlikely to have a huge surge. But having said that, we also know that there are parts of India which have still not fully experienced the second wave, the Northeast, for example. So we are still going to see some cases elsewhere. But what I'm really worried about is the metros, where we are lifting the lockdown. Some of the metros are doing it in a more measured way. Some of them are doing it in a very, very haphazard and somewhat precipitate manner of suddenly opening up all the doors. So that is where I believe we are going to have some serious concerns.
But in terms of, if we know what the third wave will be like, people are saying that it may affect children. In terms of symptoms, do we have some idea what the third wave would be like? Well, so there's a difference between each wave, we can see from the two waves.
Yes, I think the first wave, we had a much milder experience, partly because it was the original virus that we had to encounter. We didn't have to encounter the more infectious variants at that time. But also, I think the calendar was very different because we started our fairly long lockdown in March when we had very few cases. And then even after the long lockdown, we released ourselves from the lockdown in very graduated stages. Some states went on in lockdown even up to July. But even elsewhere, we found post-lockdown, we did not permit unrestricted travel. We still had some control over large gatherings. Even our festive season was relatively muted in celebration. And in very many ways, we observed a fair amount of precautions, and even masks, if not worn by everybody, at least there was some semblance of discipline there. So it was in January when we suddenly felt that we had completely liberated ourselves and we are never going to be visited by the virus again, that we went into gay abandon and then started celebrating and having mass gatherings, widespread travel, and all of that gave an opportunity for the virus to really strike back. And by this time, we had two variants. One came in by late December, January, the Alpha variant, which came in from Britain and was already establishing itself in Delhi and Punjab and Haryana. And then came the Delta variant, which was first detected in Maharashtra and then spread even more rapidly across the country to establish its dominance. And therefore, you had a very, what could be called a perfect storm. People were careless. The administration was not vigilant in controlling the crowds. And the viruses had a field day because they not only had the original virus, but the variants also came in, which could actually spread even much faster. But now in the third wave, we are going to see some differences. Now, you asked me the question about children. Let me divide up that question into four parts, if I may. First is, are the children likely to be more affected than in the first and second waves? The second question is, are more children likely to be affected than adults? Third question is, are more children going to be affected in a more severe manner than adults or as severe? And fourth is, do we need to make preparations for our health system for a predominant surge of pediatric patients? Now, the first one is, in the first wave, the children were virtually sheltered, mostly sheltered. There were no schools, people did not go out, they did not go out for markets. In the second wave, yes, they were much more exposed. Even if the schools were not there, they played, they went to tuitions, they went to movies, they went to malls, but still they were partly exposed, not fully exposed. And now in the third wave, it's likely that they may be even more exposed. And therefore, we are going to see more children available for the virus to target and infect. But at the same time, the number of adults who are susceptible will decrease because more of them would have been infected by now, more of them would have received vaccines by then, and therefore the proportions will change. But that doesn't mean that the virus is going to more severely infect children in terms of disease than in the first or second waves, though the variants may have some differences in terms of clinical manifestations. But nevertheless, if a child is infected on an average, then that child is less likely to have severe disease than an average adult who is infected. Still, the severity would be much more in the adults. So while the number of children who will get severely infected will rise, because the total number of children infected will rise, I don't think we should assume that the virus will have a special predilection to go and hunt out the children and give them very severe disease. The adults would still be the ones at greatest risk. But our health system should be ready to accommodate the larger numbers of children, even if the fraction remains the same, because the overall numbers will rise. They should make preparations for pediatric care, pediatric intensive care. And even if we actually manage to contain the third wave and keep it very low, these preparations are never going to go waste because child health requires a lot more services than we have now. And strengthening our health services for better pediatric care is always going to pay dividends in the future, even if we can, fortunately, keep the third wave down.
That's a very good point you made. It's not that the virus is going to be targeting children. It's just that children will be more available for the virus because in terms of vaccinations terms. And you've seen the immunity-wise, the children will have a milder attack.
Yes, even physiologically, because the virus tends to enter through a receptor gateway in the cell called the ACE2 receptor. The ACE2 receptors grow with age. In children, the numbers, so the children have lesser number of ACE2 receptors. And therefore, the virus doesn't have enough number of door handles to open the cells of the human body.
Nicely explained.
In children.
That's very the other issue is which a lot of people who have suffered from COVID are facing the long COVID. You know, we don't know, are these long COVID going to conditions going to be permanent? Are they going to be short-lived? What are the signs one should look for? What is worrying you most, the heart or the lung?
Well, I think many manifestations have come forth, and the percentages have differed depending upon which you are actually regarding as long COVID, which you are considering as, relatively prolonged recovery period. And all of those are coming in now. And because it also affects the psychological element, how much of it you see it as an organic manifestation, how much of it you see it as a psychological manifestation, all of those actually are affecting the actual counts. But we know conditions like severe prolonged fatigue. We know that muscle pains. We know that brain fog, confused thinking, memory lapses, all of these are much more likely. We have seen more depression also in people being reported. But what worries is much more in terms of organ damage, because it can affect, for example, the pancreas and result in diabetes. that is coming up much more to the fore now because of the damage to the pancreatic cells, which can be aggravated even by the steroids given during the treatment, but direct damage by the virus is possible. Then we are also seeing what's happening in terms of the heart muscle. It has been shown that the heart muscle can get damaged because of certain degree of inflammation, and even some degree of fibrosis can occur in the heart muscle as a result. Though it may have been overdiagnosed in the past with MRI images, and much of it doesn't seem to have a clinical consequence, still the damage is there, and that can also result in irregularities of the heartbeat. But because there is also a tendency for the virus to cause clotting of the blood vessels, both in the veins as well as in the arteries, we have seen people get heart attacks, we have seen people get strokes, and they will have a residual effect as well. The brain also seems to get affected with inflammation, and many of these things, and of course the lungs. The lungs may have a lot of fibrosis left, so you still have breathing difficulty, your exertional capacity may markedly decrease. So these are some of the things that we have been seeing in long COVID being reported. But what we'll have to really see is how long do they last? What are the treatments? Because right now there are no specific treatments identified. And we'll probably see more experience gathering in the next few months related to this.
What should a person do post-COVID? Should they do some tests? Should they look out for some signs? What would your advice be to someone? What are the symptoms to look out for?
Well, I think basically, if most of the people have mild symptoms or even asymptomatic infection, they don't have to worry, because the moment you start looking out for too many symptoms,
find something.
then you become neurotic. So you don't want to become that kind of a post-COVID neurotic. So I think the best is for you to find out whether your exercise capacity is returning to normal or not. And if you really want to find out, then you can walk and then see whether you're able to walk to the same extent as before without feeling fatigued or without feeling breathless. So those are some of the tests that you can do for yourself and see what happens. Otherwise, if it's muscle pain or if it is brain fog, then they will automatically manifest, and those signals you'll be able to find out for yourself.
I have to tell you, I'm one of those nearly neurotic people. When anybody talks about blood pressure, I rush and take mine, or escalated heartbeat, I feel I've got that. So any issue you hear, because such is the atmosphere that we are living in, which is why I wanted some, tangible markers from you.
Well, you should keep company of people who keep talking of well-being. Maybe that will become infectious.
I think I need to do more interviews with you for sure. But moving on to another preventive, which is the vaccinations. You've been stressing a lot, A, on the importance of it, B, also on the gap between the two vaccinations. Is it still 12 weeks, or you feel that it should be shorter?
See, my concern was only that people who are most at risk, the elderly, should receive the maximum protection. And since the trials had actually gone in for some of these vaccines, anywhere between 4 weeks to 12 weeks, going beyond 12 weeks may not be the right thing. And because the variants are there and they're much more infectious, we may want to bring it down to a period of between 8 to 12 weeks for the people most at risk, people above 45 years of age, and people with serious comorbidities, because we want to give them the maximum protection. Others, like, for example, 18 to 44 who do not have serious comorbidities, perhaps the 12 to 16 weeks is perfectly fine. So that was my general position. But if ultimately the government feels that this is the best way to do it, to protect everybody with a vaccine as much as possible, as many as possible, until more vaccines are available, and hope that the immunity that is acquired will be helpful for each, then that's fine. But ultimately, I think the important thing is this debate should not actually cause an impression that the vaccines are ineffective. All we are saying is, should we use the more effective dosage schedule to protect the most vulnerable? But we recognize that the vaccines are now basically working. They are quite effective. And even against the Delta variant, they have been shown to be quite effective. So in no sense should we lose confidence in the vaccines, even if we are juggling around a little bit with the dosing intervals.
I just want to talk to you about the Delta Plus variant and how will our old vaccinations handle the new variant?
Well, the Delta Plus is actually an additional mutation added to the previous Delta variant. Now, the Delta variant had acquired one prominent mutation, apart from some minor mutations, from what was previously existing in Brazil and in other parts of the world, even in South Africa for that matter, but Brazil mostly and elsewhere. And in the second component it had was from California. And they increased its infectious nature quite a lot. Now it has acquired a third prominent mutation, which it has taken from the beta variant. Now, the beta variant was originally found out in South Africa. It was considered to be very infectious and somewhat problematically also more capable of vaccine evasion or vaccine escape. Now, that particular trait, one of those traits, has also been acquired, borrowed from the South African variant or the beta variant. And now you have three prominent mutations in this, what was called the double mutant. So it's now acquired a three-piece suit. Previously, now it's acquired an additional waistcoat. And in that three-piece suit, it appears to be more infectious and could possibly have a little more impact on the vaccine. We do not know yet. But at the moment, its numbers are still restricted. Whether it is going to beat the Delta variant itself and take its place as the most dominant virus, or whether it's going to be restricted in circulation, we'll have to wait and see. Whether the old Dawn is going to be displaced by the youngster, or whether the youngster will be beaten back by the old Dawn, we'll see.
And in terms of the new, the new enforcers, what are the new vaccinations on the anvil that you are hopeful for, especially for India?
Well, actually, I think there are a number of vaccines using the currently available platforms, but I'm also hopeful about a number of new platforms which are being tried out because of the variants. Firstly, of course, we are seeing a number of vaccines coming up in India, whether it is the DNA vaccine, whether it is the virus subparticle vaccine. The first one is from Zydus Cadila, the second is from Biological E. We are also seeing mucosal vaccines which can be inhaled. We are also talking about some of the orally ingestible vaccines, which is also another form of a mucosal vaccine. And then we are seeing some of the other vaccines that have been well tested abroad, like Novavax is coming into India, is going to be produced in India by Serum Institute of India. It's already shown a more than 90% efficacy. So these are all very positive signs for us, that number of new vaccines using the currently available platforms, plus some mucosal vaccines which are going to be using new modalities are going to come forth. But in order to beat the variants, now the interesting part about the variants is that the vaccines that are currently available are, except for the inactivated virus vaccine, which is the Bharat Biotech Covaxin, as well as some of the Chinese vaccines. Otherwise, everything else is focusing on the spike protein. As Catherine Wu puts it in an article in The Atlantic, it is almost a monogamous affair with the spike protein. But now it says that we may have to think of other things now, because the spike protein is on the outer surface of the virus. And if it develops a lot of mutations in the spike protein, it may be able to evade the antibodies. The antibodies strike the virus when it is circulating in the blood. The antibodies can't attack the virus when it has entered our cells. For that, we need the T cells. So they're looking at vaccines which are more predominantly focusing on T cells and which can actually capture the virus inside the cell, even if the antibodies fail against the spike protein mutations. Then they're also looking at multiple antigens. Just as the inactivated virus, for example, in the Covaxin, offers a broader platter of antigens, more antigens. One is called the nucleocapsid antigen. The other one is ORF3 antigen, which is like different parts of the virus, which can actually be then targeted, and a whole inactivated virus can therefore generate immunity against multiple components of the virus. So even if the virus manages, because of its spike protein mutations, to evade the antibodies of the current spike protein focused vaccines, then having a larger number of antigens to present to the body will help. Now, what people are doing is, some of them are, for example, in the US, there's a California company which is bringing together these three antigens as a package. That is the spike protein antigen, the nucleocapsid, which is the one that wraps the genetic material of the virus, and ORF3, which helps the newly replicated viruses to wriggle out of the cell, out of the infected human cells, and then start spreading. So all these three antigens are being packed together into one vaccine. And that means that you will have a much broader target to attack for the immune system. And the virus may escape one snare, but it can't escape all the traps.
So then, is it a good idea to mix vaccinations? Take different types so they do different roles.
Well, that was actually a challenge in the beginning, because the purists will always say, no, you must stick to whatever was the trial protocol, because science tells you that you have tested it in the trial with a particular protocol. You have to stick to that protocol and you can't really deviate from that. Otherwise, why did we give you a regulatory permission? Because we never did the trial with mixing of the vaccines. But that would be the purest way of looking at it. But now what is happening is, because the virus itself may need more targets for attack, and different vaccines have different strengths, even in terms of targeting the different parts of the virus and different mechanisms of action, people are thinking that it may be better to use different vaccines, one in the first dose and one in the second dose. And this concept has been already tried out partly in the Russian vaccine, Sputnik, where they're using two different adenoviruses, human adenoviruses, AD5 and AD26, in the two different shots. But even more radical is the approach of using the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, one shot of each. And that has been tried out in at least in two places in Europe. And a German trial has reported that if you actually use that combination, you have 3.9 times more immunity generated than using either vaccine alone. So it appears that this particular way of mixing these two is quite useful, and many others are trying to do that. And perhaps even with our Covishield and Covaxin, because Covishield targets the spike protein and is probably more effective in targeting the spike protein, whereas the Covaxin offers the broader platter of antigens, more broad spectrum immunity, though the immunity against spike protein itself may be slightly diluted because it has to spread out its immunity much more, immune response much more. So having both of them mixed may be a very good idea. But then all of them will have to be tried out now, at least in small trials, for us to justify it.
Do we have time? Because there's one thing this virus has taught us, that no time for procedures. We have to think out of the box.
Yes, I mean, we'll have to improvise a fair amount. I mean, a certain amount of biological rationale and accumulating experience from practical what's happening in the world, we'll have to try and open up the new doors. Otherwise, previously, as I said, the purists would have insisted that every formulation, every modification needs a full-fledged trial. Now, at this point, we are not able to do that. We are having to improvise our shots even as we play the game.
That is true. And finally, before I go, do you think the cases of black fungus are on a decrease, or is it that, because COVID is on a decrease, so those who already have it, and then...
I think because the cases themselves have come down quite a lot, and even the home care use of steroids has also come down quite a lot. We are seeing the black fungus come down quite a fair amount. So, but we'll have to wait and watch what happens if there is a third wave, and what are the learnings that we have gathered in this wave that will help us prevent that. not to excessively use steroids, use them well when necessary, make sure that your oxygen supply lines are without contamination, make sure that you are not reusing masks too frequently because that can also carry a fungus particle, and monitor blood sugars when people are put on steroids so that the sugars can be controlled very well without giving opportunity for the fungus to grow. I mean, these are all the things that we have learned now. And don't misuse antibiotics, because prolonged use of antibiotics can also give the fungus an opportunity to grow. I mean, these are the lessons we have learned in the second wave, when we had a lot of careless prescription, careless management. So if we can really codify our management practices for the third wave and strictly observe that, maybe the black fungus will become a thing of the past.
On that note, thank you, Professor, for this conversation and for joining us, and wish you all the best and stay safe. Thank you.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.